whoever emerges the winner of the United States presidential election, analysts say it's looking increasingly likely that there could be a substantial shift in America's diplomatic and policy approach towards Africa and the rest of the developing world. A second term for President Trump, they say, may signal more isolationist policies towards these nations. On the other hand, a victory for Joe Biden could trigger a return to established democratic, diplomatic, and bilateral traditions between the United States and its known allies, particularly in Africa, south of the Sahara. To join us for a discussion on this is Ambassador Usman Sarki, Directing Staff at the National Institute for Policy and Strategic Studies. Good morning, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on your show. Thank you.
Good morning, Ambassador Sarki. Thank you very much for obliging us. Well, very quickly, I mean, the way the counting is going in the United States, it looks like there's going to be a Biden presidency. What could be the implications of a Biden presidency for Africa, even if, as we both know, Africa didn't feature much in the debates or in the campaigns? Then, in addition to that, your general take on the unfolding situation in the United States.
Well, thank you very much, Doctor. First of all, let me address the second question, which is the situation in the United States, because it's the domestic setting that informs the foreign policy of a country. Now, there is a state of uncertainty in the United States today, and that uncertainty may lead to some structural issues between now and the point where the new president can consolidate his government and find his direction in terms of leading the country. So the president, before paying much attention to foreign policy, will have to fix the situation at home to correct the situation in the country, to address structural issues, systemic issues, governance issues, and to really heal the wound in America and to seek to close the divide in the country before he could feel safe and strong enough to venture into the diplomatic arena. So today the situation in the US is rather very divisive, very polarized, and very tense. And racial cleavages and differences between middle class and lower class people, and also the dismantling of the establishment over the last 4 years by Donald Trump will need to be fixed before any constructive measure can be taken to address international situations. And let me refer your viewers to an article that Joe Biden wrote in Foreign Affairs magazine in March-April 2020 edition. He outlined his foreign policy vision, and in it he essentially said, first and foremost, he will attend to domestic issues. Key among these issues were to close the divide in America, to attend to education, health care, and also issues like immigration, to find a direction on those internal issues before addressing the foreign policy issue. Now, this is the setting in the America today, as I see it. In terms of the foreign policy posture of Joe Biden, first and foremost, let us remember that he is not a stranger to diplomacy. He was the chairman of the the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for a long time. He has been in the thick of diplomacy, of the American diplomacy. He has been to war zones like Iraq and Afghanistan when he was in the Senate. And also as vice president, he has actually shaped from the background the direction of US diplomacy. So he is not coming from a blank point into administration. He is coming with a huge experience in diplomacy and foreign policy. So he will know how to order his priorities, and he will know how to leverage the levers of diplomacy and foreign relations in America, and also to renew ties based on practice, based on tried and tested relationships. First and foremost, Joe Biden will heal the rift between America and Europe, because Europe is the firmest anchor of American diplomacy globally. Secondly, he will actually look at re-energizing the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in order to contain any perceived threat coming from Russia, for instance, and other threats to Europe and the Atlantic Alliance. He will re-engage Russia in the nuclear disarmament process, at least to restart negotiations which have faltered and have even been set back by Donald Trump. He will address issues also like trade and tariff between European countries on steel, on aluminum, on car imports to America, on intellectual property, and also on the way Europeans are looking at American tech giants like Google, Facebook, and others, the way they tax them or penalize them for infringements. So these are issues he would like to smoothen with America. I think the next area he will look at will be Asia. He will take on relationship with China to see how he will bring equilibrium in between the relationship, and to reduce the tension and bridge the gap between China and America as they stand today. He will reassure Japan about America's readiness to stand by Japan to provide both conventional and nuclear protection to Japan. He will re-engage North Korea in a way that will satisfy South Korea and the broader interest of the United States, and also address the concerns of Japan as far as the relationship with North Korea entail. After Asia, I think Biden will look at Russia. U.S.-Russia relationship has been topsy-turvy since the allegations of Russia's intervention in elections in America, and also some unorthodox behavior like spying, espionage by Russia in America. So he will need to restart negotiation to establish trust between the two countries and address security and strategic issues between them. Having done this kind of brinkmanship globally, I will come to Africa. I think Joe Biden will be more sensitive to the needs and concerns of Africa than Donald Trump had shown. Donald Trump had shown complete disdain for Africa. He has called African countries very unpalatable names. He has shown lack of interest to Africa completely in the last 4 years. But Joe Biden is somebody who understands the historical ties between Africa and the United Nations, between the United States, and also he knows that his base, the strong base he had domestically, comes from the African-American constituency. And Africans who are in America, who actually rallied round to support his campaign and voted for him massively. So these sensitivities will ensure that Joe Biden sees Africa from a new perspective than what Donald Trump has done for now. And in this regard, I think we Africans too, we have something to do in order to make America feel that we are important. We cannot sit back and expect Joe Biden to reach out to Africa to make course corrections without us engaging with America. So there are a few places where he will look at vis-a-vis Africa. Number one, nuclear security conference. Under Obama, African heads of states were invited to Washington to meet with Obama under the nuclear security conference or summit. I think Biden will renew that conference so that African heads of state will be called in order to discuss general security and particularly issue of nuclear security and non-proliferation in Africa, and to support America's viewpoint on issues like approach to Iran, approach to Russia, approach to North Korea within the United Nations system. Secondly, you remember, sir, that during his time as vice president and Obama as president, they evolved they came up with what was called Power Africa Initiative, giving about $13 billion to Africa to develop their power infrastructure. So Joe Biden may develop another strategy of engagement, either to revive the Power Africa or to bring his own type of arrangement to engage with Africa that will provide some economic stimulus to the continent. Maybe he will look at the health area or education area and give some sort of, if you like, Marshall Plan to assist Africa out.
Well,
but Africa should also expect a strong emphasis from Joe Biden as president on 2 or 3 key areas. Number one, the deepening of democracy in Africa will be a fundamental factor in the relationship between the U.S. and Africa. Secondly, the issue of human rights is something that is very fundamental to the American foreign policy establishment. And when it comes to Africa, that will be one of the underlying factors to engage with Africa. And under human rights, the issue of gender equality, the issue, unfortunately, the issue of rights of same-sex marriages and things like that may come up. So we have to be very wary and cautious about those things. So this is the general outline I could give you in terms of the engagement with Africa.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, you mentioned African heads of state being called to this conference by President Obama, and you'll recall that President Trump received only 2 African presidents in the Oval Office, which is far less than any of his predecessors. He cut foreign aid to Africa, cut immigration to Africa, made racist comments, but he did have his Prosper Africa initiative. Although even that was criticized, and this is what I would like you to address. The fact that America is perceived now as seeing Africa not as having intrinsic value as a sound investment, but seeing Africa as a pawn in its chess game with China.
Yeah. Well, actually, you remember last year, was it last year or 2018, the former National Security Advisor to Donald Trump, John Bolton, Ambassador John Bolton, gave a dinner speech at one of the right-wing conservative establishment, where he essentially spelled out the policy drift of America towards Africa. And he did not actually locate Africa independently in its own right as an entity that America could deal with. He linked Africa to the rivalry between the United States on one hand and China and Russia on the other. So in that speech, clearly he made it very, very plain that U.S. relationship with Africa will be contingent upon the dynamics of the relationship between the U.S. and China and Russia. So like you rightly pointed out, they saw us as a pawn on the bigger chessboard of global diplomacy and international rivalry between China and Africa. And likewise, the former Secretary of State that was dismissed by Trump the moment he visited Nigeria and he left, Trump actually relieved him of his office.
Tillerson.
He too, before coming to Africa, he gave a speech at one of the universities, I think either one of George Mason University, I think, where he outlined American policy. And he still linked it to the dynamics of relationship with China and Russia. So they saw us within the context as a peripheral entity that can be placed or located within the dynamics of relationship between China and Russia and the US. So we did not feature independently in our own right under Donald Trump. So, but I think this is where Joe Biden will make a course correction, make a shift, and give Africa its rightful entitlement. But before we claim any rightful entitlement, I am suggesting that we too should look inwards, reorder our priorities, and see how we can constructively and correctly engage with the United States. Okay. We cannot sit back, adopt a laissez-faire attitude, and expect the United States to take us along as a respectable partner. Okay. And remember, in international diplomacy, the most concrete aspect, the pillar on which diplomacy rests, is respect for other nations. So if respect is eroded or destroyed, as Donald Trump has done, the entire diplomatic structure will collapse, and it will be brought down because of the disrespect that is shown. And if you remember recently what the president of Iran made a speech, and he said what Iran wanted was just for America to show respect to Iran. That is all. And I think every self-respecting nation or region should demand respect first and foremost. Okay. So the way Donald Trump treated us, it's very disrespectful, and actually it should not have been allowed to pass.
Okay, I just want to still expatiate with questions on Africa. I want to know what you think about the future of initiatives like PEPFAR. A lot of people are quick to say America has not done anything for Africa, but PEPFAR has gulped over 85 billion and counting. And one of the biggest, arsenals in the fight against AIDS and disease in Africa has been PEPFAR. I want to know your take on AGOA. And while you were speaking, was it deliberate, or you didn't mention the year-on-year over 10 or 15 billion that America gives to Egypt, for instance, to take care of its business in, the Arab world? That money is still going on, and it didn't stop under Trump, and that partnership is still there, and it's still palpable. And in fact, one of the African leaders that went to meet Trump was Al-Sisi.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. America's diplomacy actually, works out at two levels. The first level is at the presidential level. So presidents come up with initiative. The paper that you mentioned was George Bush Jr., who brought it out, and to address the HIV/AIDS pandemic in Africa. And AGOA, as you rightly recall, was a President Clinton initiative. And the Power Africa initiative was Obama initiative. So these are presidential initiatives to engage with Africa. And they did so on the recognition that there are gaps, there are challenges, there are improvisations that needed to be addressed structurally, and by injecting funds and resources into the relationship between the US and Africa, and also to make the US relevant and important in the African equation. So they adopted these issues. The second layer of relationship in America in terms of diplomacy is bipartisan relationship that involves the president and the Congress. Regardless of which party is in power, there are certain things American diplomacy considers as sacrosanct. So out of the Camp David agreement, it emerged that America will have to support Egypt for so long as that agreement exists in terms of bolstering up Egypt's military and economy. So those, and also the same goes for Israel. So those bipartisan agreements are almost sacrosanct, and they cannot be touched by any president. And that is why they continued like that up till today. So having made these two distinctions, I want to say that it is left for African leaders, to sit down, to recognize where their interests are, where the priorities should be, and approach America in terms of those priorities. For instance, if I would be so bold as to suggest Africans could sit down, go through the African Union 2063 agenda, Agenda 2063, or the Program of Infrastructure Development for Africa, which is PIDA, and look at the critical areas where American intervention can make a difference. And when they meet individually or severally with the U.S. leadership, they could lay those priorities on the table to say, look, these are our concerns. We have heard you when you say we should democratize, respect human rights, be more wary of China and Russia. We have heard you. We will consider your propositions. We too, we have propositions to offer to you, where our interests lie, where priorities are. And then they can table those regional priorities for the United Nations to engage. The U.S. wants to engage in Africa, but at the same time, you have to understand that the United Nations, to some extent or to a large extent, its foreign economic involvements are driven by the private sector. So the U.S. would like to see an atmosphere, conditions created for the intervention or the participation of its private sector in any country or region, so that those private sector entities can come from the perspective of profit-making into programs and activities. So we have to now make room for the U.S. private sector to come in areas like infrastructure development, where they are not actually participating today. They have to come into mining and agriculture. They are more visible in the oil and gas industry than in agriculture, in roads and railways. We have to bring them on board. And I think we have to set the priorities and provide attractive terms for them to come on board.
Well, Ambassador, two quick follow-up questions. The first one is what you said about domestic policy driving foreign policy. And I get to hear that all the time. But in Nigeria, will you say that we follow that, what you may call the gold standard in terms of the foreign policy process? And then secondly, you talked about the erosion of respect in terms of international relations by President Trump. Are there other ways in which President Trump has damaged international relations, multilateralism, bilateralism, which should be main priorities for a Biden presidency if that happens?
Yes, well, thank you, sir, for this question. If you look at the immediate American neighborhood or the region, President Trump has done considerable damage to relations between the U.S. and Canada, between the U.S. and Mexico, between U.S. and Central America and Latin American countries. So Joe Biden has his work cut out for him, unfortunately, to remodel and rebuild relationships with all these countries. President Trump came into office with a transactional attitude to diplomacy. He jettisoned existing principles and practices, brought in his own concepts of diplomacy, which is based on making deals and putting America first, which unfortunately others said made America alone. You know, so Joe Biden will have to fix relationship with Mexico on immigration, on investment, on American investment, particularly in the automobile and other areas in Mexico. And also he has to reach out to Central American and Latin American countries and treat those countries on the basis of respect, mutual understanding, if you look at the failed approach of Trump to Venezuela, it was catastrophic. You know, quite terrible. It exacerbated this instability in Venezuela and also isolated Venezuela entirely from the region and the world. So President Biden will need to really recalibrate relationship with those countries. Now, if you look at how Donald Trump treated Europe, key European allies like Germany and others, you know, it was something that Europeans never expected would happen, you know, but he did it. He disrupted he forced them to pay more for their defense. He cut, you know, he increased tariffs for European imports of steel and aluminum and others for their vehicles. So these are areas where President Biden will have to look at. Now, in terms of the multilateral initiative, but there is virtually an American withdrawal from global processes like climate change. The Paris Climate Accord, excuse me, virtually was abandoned by President Donald Trump. And there was no movement towards development of green energy, green technologies, either in the US or supporting initiatives towards those in the world. Donald Trump retreated from the arms control agreements with Russia. He retreated from the United Nations. He turned the United Nations into a platform of attacks and denigration of countries. He disrupted set diplomatic practices. He disrupted relationship with the World Health Organization. He was threatening virtually the WTO not to have a preferred candidate from an African country, which happens to be Nigeria, as the next general, the head of the WTO. So these are some of the areas where disruptions have taken place, and Joe Biden will need to look at them pragmatically, with a very cool head, not from an ideological position, but from a pragmatic position that really diplomacy needs. More importantly for Europe was the way unilaterally President Trump tore up the comprehensive agreement on Iran, the JCPOA, which was really a terrible mistake. The Europeans were rendered virtually helpless. They were flabbergasted that the foremost global military and economic power in the world could adopt this kind of position based on ideology and certain warped vision of a country, to jettison, to tear up an international agreement so flagrantly. It flabbergasted Europeans, and they would like to see Joe Biden come back to that in order to engage with them collectively to deal with the situation in Iran. Now, in terms of, you asked me whether in Nigeria domestic issues will drive foreign policy. Well, I think, you know, that scenario applies. You know, we take the pulse domestically. I think the government takes the pulse domestically in order to construct its foreign policy. But you see, there are also other scenarios whereby external influences impose themselves on you as a nation, and you respond to those external influences regardless of what the internal domestic situations are. So if the initiative emanates from the government, internal considerations are taken as a factor in the overall thinking and construction of foreign policy. But the issues actually are derived from outside, then they have to be looked at from the fundamental basis of their merit. So I will venture to say that the government in Nigeria, or successive governments, have been basing their foreign policy constructs on internal dynamics of the country. Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador. You'll recall that last week, Philip Walton, the American hostage, was freed by U.S. Navy SEALs. Is this an isolated event or something that the Biden administration might build on in the area of insecurity, considering the fact that jihadi extremists also present pose a serious threat to U.S. national security?
Well, not only to U.S. national security, but to everybody's security, really. You know, and since this government, Buhari's government, came into power 2015, they have been stressing that there is a threat of extremists and terrorists, you know, posing an existential threat to Nigeria, and they will deal with it. And they did not really limit their focus internally within Nigerian territory also, but they are looking at the larger, they are looking at the larger Lake Chad Basin and the Sahel region to assess the threat, particularly the fallout of the Libyan war. So, and also what is happening in Mali and other parts of the Sahel. So the threat comes from various quarters, they surround us, and we have to calibrate the extent that these threats present challenges to us, and to see to what extent we will also go in order to tackle those threats. So processes are in place, discussions are going on, consultations are going on with neighbors and members of the international community to see how Nigeria could best adapt itself, strategize, and deal with those threats. So the recent injection of U.S. operatives to extricate one of the nationals, you know, supposedly without anybody's knowledge, has come as a surprise to Nigerians. But I will venture to say that the Americans cannot come into a country without actually speaking to people in the security establishment to get cooperation from them, and also to get certain intelligence outlines and contributions before they enter into the country. But some may argue that no, Americans will not do that because their intelligence might be compromised. But these are very murky issues that cannot be really understood from the surface. They have to be really, we have to wait for time to reveal the exact circumstances for us to know really what went on. But this is an isolated incident. We should not presuppose that that incident itself defines Nigeria's national security strengths or weaknesses, or our foreign policy priorities, or the absence of priorities. It's a singular, unexpected, isolated incident that should provide us lessons, but it should not really be conditional to how our system has been existing so far, or how we are operating our security and foreign policy programs and strategies, in Nigeria.
Okay. Real quickly, I want to still further the conversation on security and talk about the need to prosecute various uprisings across Africa and wars, and the role the Leahy Law in America has played against, getting weapons for African countries. What's your take on that?
Yeah. Well, the Leahy Law actually was predicated about preventing the misuse of American ordinances, that is, weapons, by third country militaries in fighting wars and insurgencies, whereby they commit egregious human rights violations. So it's a national instrument introduced by Senator Leahy and adopted by the Congress as an amendment to any arms trade agreement between countries and the United States. What should come as a surprise is the extraterritorial nature of the Leahy Amendment. So if, for instance, just as an example, Nigeria is to acquire weapons from a third country for another country, the U.S. may raise objection because of its preponderant influence to say, no, we object that you should give such and such country weapons of this nature because we don't expect them to use these weapons reasonably. So what we should do, or what we have done since this government came to power, is to engage the Americans constructively and give them assurances that we have capable and responsible armed forces, that we have embedded human rights training into the military system, that we are very cautious in the use of our weapons, not to use them in civilian areas, but also in extreme situations where there are direct confrontations with extremists, with the Boko Haram. And on the basis of that explanation and engagement, when President Muhammadu Buhari met President Donald Trump, they struck an agreement for Trump to release the sale of the Tucano A-3 attack aircraft for Nigeria. So the Leahy Amendment does not obstruct completely Americans' engagements with Nigeria. So we are actually on track. If Biden comes in, we will continue with this relationship. They know Nigerian military is very professional, it respects human rights, and it can conduct itself according to international rules of engagement.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Sarki, for joining us on the morning show.